Hey everyone, it's Andrew from Aurora Gameworks. Welcome back to another part of this space shooter tutorial series. In this part, we will be continuing where we left off last time, where we finished all of the code and logic for firing at and destroying enemy ships. And this episode we are going to have the enemy ships fire at us and have the enemy inflict damage on the player. So first things first, let's go into our enemy parent blueprint, and on our event begin play, we're going to create a branch where we'll get our can shoot variable, which we can set this on a per child actor basis, depending on if we want certain enemies to fire or not. And on true, we would want it to start a custom event that we'll call start firing. So let's just make that event now, start firing. So then on can shoot true, we'll then have our start firing occur. And if you don't want the start firing to happen the moment that an enemy spawns in, this is where you could just add a slight delay here, and you can set it to whatever value you want. I'm just going to set it to 1 second. Cool, so the start firing logic. The firing logic on our enemies is going to be rather similar to the way that we have the firing logic on our player ship. So first we'll just get a sequence, then we'll get a gate, plug in our start firing to sequence. We want our then 0 to go into open, and our then 1 will go into enter. We can also create another custom event here, which we can call end firing or stop firing, and plug that into close. On exit gate, we want another sequence, and on then 1, we're going to have our delay. So we plug it like this, and then we get our fire rate amount, which we set here. By default, I'm just going to have this be 0.5. Put it into a multiply like this, and for our a float value, for now we can just make this a literal float with a value of 1. And then on completed, this goes back into enter on our gate. Before we go and spawn our enemy projectile, we're going to do a quick check here, which is optional, but I like to do it. It's where we get the enemy actor location, we break the vector, and we only want to get its sort of world location distance on the x-axis up and down here. And we're going to do a check where we only want it firing whilst it's within like a certain world position. That can stop them from firing at the player off the top of the screen, or continuing to fire once it's past the bottom of the screen. So we'll just get X, we'll get in range, we'll hook up our branch, hook up the boolean, and our minimum and maximum, we can make the minimum -500 and the maximum 7,000. And we can check later if that's good or not. And so after that, here is where we can spawn our projectile actor. So just go spawn actor from class. Let's get our projectile actor. Before we actually do anything, let's manually type in first projectile parent, which will then expose these. And then we can plug in the class, compile and save. It has an error because we haven't set up a spawn transform yet, but here for the damage multiplier and the projectile speed, here you can set it to be whatever you want. So to get the spawn transform of where we want the projectiles to spawn on our enemy ship, we're going to do just like a quick copy and paste on our player ship that we done, where we got our socket locations. So in this example, we're just going to assume that the enemy ship only has 1 gun barrel to fire from. So I'm just going to copy from the left socket. Let's also get the transform here that has it rotated to be aiming the right way. And we grab a mesh from our components list inside our enemy blueprint. We hook up the target, and then we put our return value on the make transform here to spawn transform. So with our enemy parent firing logic set up, now we just need to make an enemy specific projectile. So we want to create some more logic in our projectile parent blueprint. And here is where we're going to drag off of player. Before we add anything into our player branch here, we're going to create two Boolean variables. First one being called harm enemies, and the second one harm player. Here we can basically tell each projectile what things that it can actually harm and inflict damage on. It also means that if we have the projectile set to harm enemies false, it means that when the enemies fire, then there's no chance of the projectile colliding with itself or its surrounding fellow enemies. So with these booleans now just created, compile and save. And before we forget, let's back out and go to our player projectile 1 child blueprint. And here we would want to make harm enemies true and harm player false, because this is the player projectile. Back inside the projectile parent, let's just add in a couple of branches. First we'll go back and work on the enemy branch, and we'll plug in harm enemies here so that all of this logic that happens here with the health check on the enemy ships and then destroying itself can only happen if this is set to true. And the same thing applies to checking on player, except it'll be a check on harm player, true or false. So now we just need to get a reference to the player from our event begin overlap. So we'll just get cast to player BP, right click and convert to a pure cast. On harm player, we're going to just make sure that the player is actually currently alive, and also check if they're invincible or not. So get invincible not, because we want to inflict damage onto the player if they're not invincible. And actually we want to set this onto two different branches, because if the player is not alive, then we can just not do anything, but like this can just go to nowhere. But then on invincible, when we plug it up like that, on true we would have the code that harms the player, actually lowers the player's health and does the player health check. But then on false, we would still want to do the destroy projectile. So to lower the player's health, let's just extend our reference to the player blueprint. Let's get health, and then we'll subtract a value, and then we will set the health to be that new subtracted value. And we are subtracting it by damage multi times damage, and then we plug that into the subtraction. So we haven't yet made a health check function on our player, but it's very similar to the health check function on the enemy ship. So we'll just go to our player blueprint, create a new function, call it health check. It's just a simple branch with health. Does it equal or go under 0? If true, then we would set ourselves to not be alive. We can spawn an emitter at location, which is our player ship exploding, which will be at get actor location. And then we can make the explosion just a little bit bigger and compile and save. So I think in the next part we'll work on actually respawning the player, which we can drive that code here later on in this health check function. But for now, this is all we need. So let's close player BP. And then inside projectile parent again, we can now implement our new health check function. And then once going through this, we can just simply tell the projectile to destroy itself. So we go destroy actor, and then we make sure that on invincible not false, that also gets plugged into destroy actor like that. So now we can close out of our projectile parent, and we can make a new child blueprint, which we'll just call enemy projectile 1. And we can also set the glow to be a different color. So if we go to glow, let's just copy and paste this, and then we can make a sort of orange color, and this is just to be able to tell the difference between different projectiles on screen. So then we know that all the ones that are yellowish orange are ones that have been fired from enemies, and we can set that here now in our enemy projectile. And in class defaults, we want harm player to be true and harm enemies to be false. Compile and save. Back into our enemy parent, and let's set the default projectile actor in enemy parent to be the newly created enemy projectile 1. Compile and save there as well. Make sure that everything is plugged in, yes, and we can give this a playtest. So here you can see we have a slight issue where we have the projectile spawn emitting sort of around the wrong way. That should be a simple fix where we go into our spawn actor, and instead of making this a -90, we can just make it 90. And if we try that again, the projectiles should now be firing towards the player. There we go. So 2 things to note that we can polish up. First thing that we notice is that once the enemies arrive on screen, it still takes them a while to actually start firing. So that sort of check if they're within a range number that we put in, we can probably extend that or just remove it. And the second issue that I noticed is that when we had the health check thing set on the player, we had it so that if player is on 0 health, then we will create an explosion emitter. And here we can see that once we get hit just one time, our player ship sort of it gets exploded immediately. And that is because inside our player blueprint, our health variable is set to 0. So we need to make sure that that's set to 100 by default. Compile and save. I'm sorry, this is something that I should be looking out for. This shouldn't have been set to 0 in the first place, but now it is at 100, so all goods. And the other slight issue that we had was just the enemies not firing when they came off the top of the screen. Rather, they would start firing closer to when they're in the middle. So if we just go to enemy parent, and we go here where we had our branch for check if they're in range, we need our max value here to be a little bit higher. So rather than 7,000, we could set that to, let's go 11,000. And to make sure that our player ship actually looks like it has disappeared and been destroyed on death, we can go back into our health check here in our play blueprint, grab the mesh, and then just on here set the visibility to false, We can make a more sort of thorough version of this in the next part when we do player respawning. But for now, this should give a good effect. And now if we go and give this a playtest, we should only be hit 3 times, and then we'll have our player ship destroyed. 1, 2, 3. So yeah, we have our enemies shooting at our player working now. If you want the enemy projectiles to move faster towards the player, you can go on to enemy parent, and you can set the projectile speed here. And the stuff with the player being destroyed and respawning, we're going to work on that more in the next part of this tutorial series. So if you haven't yet, make sure that you subscribe to keep up to date. If you enjoyed this video and you thought that it was informative, please give it a like. I have been Andrew from Aurora Gameworks, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.